In early May 1945, the world finally began to breathe again. The long, dark night of war in Europe was drawing to a close. News had just broken that Adolf Hitler, the architect of unimaginable suffering, was dead. In cities across the Allied world, from London to Moscow to New York, crowds erupted in spontaneous celebration. The tyrant was gone. The downfall of his monstrous regime was now certain. It was a moment of profound relief, a collective sigh from a continent torn apart by years of bloodshed, genocide, and destruction. The end of the war felt tangible. A new dawn was on the horizon, and the forces of good had seemingly triumphed. Yet, amidst this global wave of jubilation, a quiet and formal act in Dublin sent ripples of shock and bewilderment across the world. On the 2nd of May 1945, Ireland's Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, Éamon de Valera, undertook a short journey. He walked from his government offices to the German legation on Northumberland Road. There he met with Dr. Edward Hempel, the German minister to Ireland. De Valera's purpose was simple and, in his mind, correct. He was there to offer official condolences on the death of the German head of state, Adolf Hitler. It was an act of protocol, a gesture he believed was required of a strictly neutral nation. This single act stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to the global mood. While the world celebrated the death of a man responsible for the Holocaust and the deaths of tens of millions, the leader of a democratic European nation was formally mourning his passing. The news was met with disbelief and immediate condemnation. How could this be? How could the leader of Ireland, a country that had itself fought for its freedom, extend such a courtesy to a genocidal dictator? The anachronistic gesture seemed to defy all logic and morality, placing Ireland firmly on the wrong side of history at the very moment history was being made. The international press was merciless. Headlines screamed with outrage. De Valera was painted as a Nazi sympathizer, a foolish pedant, or worse. For the Allies, who had sacrificed so much to defeat Nazism, this was a profound insult. It was a diplomatic slap in the face delivered at the moment of their greatest triumph. The handshake, the formal visit, the expression of sorrow, it all seemed incomprehensible. To understand why de Valera made this choice, a choice that would haunt his legacy and Ireland's reputation for decades, we have to look deeper. We have to examine the complex roots of Irish neutrality and the wartime tightrope he had been walking for 6 long years. Hit that like and subscribe button for more content like this. Ireland's policy of neutrality during the Second World War was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of a long and painful struggle for independence from Britain. The memory of the War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War was still fresh in the national consciousness. For centuries, Ireland had been drawn into Britain's conflicts, its people forced to fight and die for an empire that had oppressed them. When the Irish Free State was established in 1922, the desire to chart its own course, free from British foreign policy entanglements, was paramount. This fierce determination to be master of its own destiny defined the new state's identity. When war clouds gathered over Europe in the late 1930s, Ireland's position was clear. In 1937, de Valera's new constitution had solidified the nation's sovereignty. The following year, he successfully negotiated the return of the treaty ports from Britain. These ports, which Britain had retained control of after independence, were crucial. Handing them back to Ireland was a final, critical step in severing the country's military ties to its former ruler. De Valera knew that allowing a British military presence on Irish soil would make neutrality impossible. For him, staying out of the coming war was the ultimate expression of Ireland's hard-won independence. The official term for Ireland's wartime experience was not neutrality, but the emergency. This deliberate phrasing reflected the unique and precarious situation the country found itself in. It was a state of national crisis, a period where the primary goal was survival. The policy was overwhelmingly popular at home. The Irish people, having just secured their freedom, had no desire to be dragged into another major European conflict. They were focused on building their new nation, not fighting someone else's war. The government implemented strict censorship to control the flow of information and maintain a semblance of impartiality, carefully managing reports from both Allied and Axis sides. This stance, however, was not simply about avoiding a fight. It was a deeply symbolic act. For de Valera, and for many Irish citizens, neutrality was the litmus test of their sovereignty. It proved that Ireland was no longer a British dominion, but a truly independent nation capable of making its own decisions on the world stage, even if those decisions were unpopular. It was a declaration that Irish lives would no longer be sacrificed for the strategic interests of another country. This unwavering commitment to neutrality, born from a painful history, would guide every difficult decision de Valera had to make throughout the 6 years of the emergency. Staying neutral came at a significant cost. As a small island nation heavily dependent on imports, Ireland was economically vulnerable. When the war began, vital supply lines were severed. Both Britain and Germany imposed blockades, turning the seas around Ireland into a dangerous gauntlet. The country faced severe shortages of everything from petrol and coal to tea and fertilizer. The government was forced to introduce strict rationing for food, fuel, and clothing. The flickering gas lamps on city streets, a measure to save fuel, became a potent symbol of the era. The Irish people had to endure years of hardship to maintain their political stance. The social fabric of the nation was also stretched to its breaking point. The emergency, known as the Glock in Irish slang, brought a sense of isolation and anxiety. With strict censorship in place, news from the outside world was heavily filtered. The constant threat of invasion, whether from a desperate Germany or a pressured Britain, loomed large. The Irish army, though small and poorly equipped, was kept on high alert. Thousands of men joined the local defense force, a volunteer reserve, to prepare for a potential attack. This period fostered a unique bunker mentality, where the nation turned inward, focused solely on its own preservation against the raging storm outside. Economically, the pressure was immense. Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime leader, was furious with Ireland's neutrality. He saw it as a betrayal, particularly the denial of the treaty ports, which he believed cost British lives in the Battle of the Atlantic. In response, Britain imposed what amounted to an economic squeeze on Ireland, severely restricting trade and the flow of essential goods. This policy was designed to punish Ireland and force it into the war. De Valera's government had to scramble to find alternative sources and promote self-sufficiency through campaigns that urged citizens to grow your own and conserve every resource. It was a daily struggle for economic survival. Despite these hardships, the policy of neutrality held firm, largely because the alternative seemed so much worse. The Irish people looked at the devastation being unleashed across Europe and felt that their government had made the right choice. The shortages and the isolation were seen as the necessary price for peace. While tens of thousands of individual Irish citizens chose to enlist in the British forces, fighting and dying in the war against Nazism, the official state policy remained unchanged. The national consensus was that enduring economic pain was preferable to enduring the horrors of war on Irish soil. This collective sacrifice reinforced the nation's commitment to its chosen path. Éamon de Valera's leadership during the war was a masterful, if morally complex, balancing act. He had to navigate the treacherous currents between three powerful and demanding players: Britain, Germany, and the United States. Each nation exerted its own unique pressure on Ireland, and a single misstep could have led to invasion or economic ruin. De Valera's approach was one of rigid, almost theatrical public neutrality, combined with a series of secret, pragmatic concessions. He understood that to survive, Ireland had to appear impartial to all, while quietly tilting its support towards the side he knew must win the Allies. With Britain, the relationship was the most complicated. Publicly, de Valera was unyielding on the principle of neutrality, refusing Churchill's repeated demands for the treaty ports. However, behind the scenes, a significant level of covert cooperation was established. Irish intelligence services shared information with their British counterparts, particularly regarding weather reports from the Atlantic, which were vital for Allied military planning, including the D-Day landings. Allied airmen who crashed on Irish soil were quietly repatriated across the border into Northern Ireland, while German airmen were interned for the duration of the war. This was a clear, if unspoken, breach of strict neutrality. Towards Germany, de Valera maintained a facade of formal diplomatic correctness. He allowed the German legation in Dublin to remain open throughout the war, a decision that infuriated the Allies. He resisted intense pressure from the American ambassador, David Gray, to expel the German diplomats, arguing it would be a violation of neutral status and could provoke a German attack. This formal adherence to protocol provided a thin veil for his government's pro-Allied actions. It was a dangerous game. The German minister in Dublin, Eduard Hempel, was constantly reporting back to Berlin, and de Valera had to ensure that Ireland's secret cooperation with the British did not become public knowledge. The United States, especially after entering the war in 1941, was another source of immense pressure. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration saw Irish neutrality as an obstacle to the war effort. The American ambassador, David Gray, was openly hostile to de Valera's policy and campaigned relentlessly to force Ireland into the Allied camp. He saw de Valera as a stubborn, Anglophobic fantasist. Despite this, de Valera stood his ground, arguing that forcing Ireland into the war would be counterproductive and could even spark civil unrest. He managed to resist American demands while still maintaining a relationship that was crucial for post-war reconstruction, a testament to his considerable diplomatic skill. To truly understand Éamon de Valera's wartime decisions, including the infamous condolence call, one must view them through a single, powerful lens: the absolute primacy of Irish sovereignty. For de Valera, who had dedicated his life to the cause of Irish independence, the Second World War was the ultimate test. It was the first time the newly independent state had to navigate a major global crisis entirely on its own terms. Every choice he made, no matter how controversial or seemingly counterintuitive, was guided by one overarching question: what best secures and demonstrates Ireland's status as a sovereign, independent nation? This obsession with sovereignty explains his rigid public neutrality. By refusing to bow to pressure from Churchill or Roosevelt, de Valera was sending a clear message to the world, and perhaps more importantly, to his own people. The message was that Ireland was no longer a pawn in Britain's geopolitical games. It would not be coerced or cajoled into a conflict that was not of its own making. This stance was a powerful symbol of the nation's break from its colonial past. For a country whose independence was still so new, the ability to declare neutrality and make it stick was the most potent proof of its freedom. The decision to offer condolences for Hitler's death, so shocking to the outside world, makes a kind of cold, formal sense within this framework. In de Valera's mind, he was not mourning the man, but following the strict diplomatic protocol expected of a neutral state upon the death of a head of state with whom it maintained diplomatic relations. To do otherwise, he reasoned, would be to take a side. It would be a breach of the very neutrality he had so carefully constructed over 6 years. He had maintained relations with Germany throughout the war. Therefore, protocol must be followed to the bitter end. It was the logic of a mathematician, not a moralist. This perspective, however, highlights the profound limitations of such a rigid adherence to principle. De Valera's focus was so intensely fixed on the symbolism of Irish sovereignty that he appeared blind to the monumental moral catastrophe of the Nazi regime. He saw Hitler's death as a diplomatic event requiring a procedural response, not as the end of a reign of terror that had murdered millions. His actions were those of a leader trying to prove a point about his country's independence, but in doing so he failed to make a crucial moral distinction. This unwavering focus on the letter of the law of neutrality, rather than its spirit, would come to define this controversial moment in his career. The immediate aftermath of de Valera's condolence visit was a storm of international condemnation. The act was seen as, at best, a display of breathtaking naivety, and at worst a gesture of sympathy for a monstrous regime. Ireland, which had spent the war in a state of self-imposed isolation, now found itself truly alone on the world stage. The goodwill that might have existed for the small, neutral nation evaporated overnight. In its place was a mixture of contempt and anger. The Allies, who were uncovering the full, horrific extent of the concentration camps, could not comprehend how any democratic leader could offer such a gesture. Winston Churchill, long frustrated by Irish neutrality, unleashed his fury in his victory speech on the 13th of May 1945. He praised the loyalty of Northern Ireland and then turned his rhetorical fire on Dublin. He spoke of how Britain, if it had been convenient, could have invaded Ireland to secure the ports, but had shown restraint. He implied that Ireland owed its survival to Britain's magnanimity. De Valera's famous radio reply was a masterclass in patriotic rhetoric. He defended Ireland's right to neutrality with quiet dignity, arguing that the nation had chosen its own path and had stuck to it, resisting pressure from a powerful neighbor. While his speech was celebrated at home, it did little to mend fences abroad. In the post-war order, Ireland found itself a pariah. The country's application to join the newly formed United Nations in 1946 was vetoed by the Soviet Union, ostensibly because of its wartime neutrality. While this was also part of a larger Cold War political game, Ireland's controversial record made it an easy target. The nation was excluded from the Marshall Plan, the American initiative to rebuild war-torn Europe, although it later received a smaller loan. This diplomatic isolation reinforced the country's economic struggles and delayed its integration into the emerging international community. The price of de Valera's principle was being paid in full. The diplomatic chill lasted for years. For a decade after the war, Ireland remained outside the mainstream of European and global politics. The nation turned further inward, a period often associated with economic stagnation and high rates of emigration. The shadow of the condolence call lingered over Ireland's foreign relations, creating a perception of the country as insular and out of step with the modern world. It took years of patient diplomacy to repair the damage, and for Ireland to slowly rebuild its international reputation, culminating in its eventual admission to the United Nations in 1955. The short walk to the German legation had cast a very long shadow. Decades after the end of the Second World War, the legacy of Éamon de Valera's condolence call remains a subject of intense debate in Ireland. It is a moment that refuses to settle comfortably into the national story. For some, it represents a profound moral failure, a permanent stain on the country's reputation. This viewpoint argues that by adhering to a cold and rigid interpretation of neutrality, de Valera ignored a fundamental moral imperative. He failed to stand with humanity against the absolute evil of the Nazi regime. In this view, the act was a shameful episode where legalistic pedantry triumphed over basic human decency. On the other side of the debate are those who defend de Valera's actions, or at least seek to understand them in their proper context. They argue that his primary, and indeed only responsibility was to the people of Ireland. His goal was to keep the nation safe and sovereign in a world at war. The condolence visit, they contend, was the final, logical step in a 6-year policy of unwavering neutrality. It was not an endorsement of Nazism, but a formal procedural act intended to prove Ireland's impartiality to the very end. For these defenders, de Valera was a pragmatist who made a difficult choice to protect his small, vulnerable nation. This controversy has shaped how Ireland sees itself and its place in the world. The memory of the emergency and the backlash against de Valera's actions have fostered a complicated relationship with the concept of neutrality. On one hand, it is a cherished principle, deeply rooted in the nation's history of anti-colonialism. On the other, it is associated with a moment of perceived moral ambiguity. This tension continues to influence contemporary debates in Ireland about its role in international affairs, particularly regarding military alliances and peacekeeping missions. The question of whether neutrality can ever be truly neutral, or if it sometimes becomes a shield for inaction, is a direct legacy of this period. Ultimately, de Valera's visit to the German legation serves as a complex and uncomfortable chapter in Irish history. It cannot be easily dismissed as either wholly right or wholly wrong. It was the action of a leader whose political vision was forged in the crucible of a struggle for independence, a vision that prioritized national sovereignty above all else. While his logic was consistent with the policy he had pursued for 6 years, it failed to account for the extraordinary moral context of Hitler's death. The act remains a powerful historical lesson on the collision between political principle and universal morality, a moment that continues to challenge and provoke the Irish national conscience. The story of Ireland's wartime neutrality offers profound lessons about the challenges of non-alignment in a world defined by conflict. It raises a fundamental question: is true neutrality ever really possible? De Valera's experience suggests that it is a far more complex and compromised position than it appears. While he maintained a public facade of perfect impartiality, his government was secretly aiding the Allies. This pro-Allied neutrality was a pragmatic necessity for survival. It demonstrates that for a small nation wedged between powerful blocs, neutrality is often not a pure ideal, but a delicate performance, a series of calculated risks and hidden compromises. De Valera's dilemma also highlights the inherent paradox of non-alignment. The goal of a neutral state is to remain detached from the conflicts of others, yet its very existence is constantly shaped and pressured by those conflicts. Ireland sought to be an island of peace in a sea of war, but the waves kept crashing on its shores. The economic blockades, the diplomatic pressure from Britain and America, and the ever-present threat of invasion all showed that no nation is truly an island. This experience teaches us that neutrality is not a passive state, but an active and often exhausting struggle to maintain autonomy against powerful external forces. Furthermore, the controversy surrounding the condolence call forces us to confront the moral limits of neutrality. When a conflict involves a clear aggressor and a victim, or when one side commits acts that defy our shared sense of humanity, can a neutral stance remain morally tenable? De Valera's actions suggest that a strict adherence to diplomatic protocol can lead to a form of moral blindness. It poses a difficult question for leaders today. At what point does a commitment to non-interference become complicity? At what point must a nation set aside its policy and take a moral stand, even at great risk? Modern leaders can draw valuable, if difficult, lessons from de Valera's wartime leadership. His story is a case study in the immense pressures faced by small nations in a world of superpowers. It underscores the importance of pragmatic diplomacy and the need to balance national interest with international perception. But it also serves as a stark warning. It shows that actions intended to be seen as principled can be interpreted as morally bankrupt. It teaches that a leader's legacy is defined not only by their ability to protect their people, but also by the moral clarity of the choices they make on the world stage. Today is the 20th of January 2026, and the world is once again grappling with complex geopolitical tensions. The lessons from Ireland's wartime experience, and specifically from de Valera's most controversial decision, feel more relevant than ever. Nations around the globe are once again navigating the pressures between rival powers, facing choices about where their allegiances lie. The debate over engagement versus isolation and principle versus pragmatism continues to define modern foreign policy. De Valera's story is not just a historical curiosity, it is a living lesson in the timeless dilemmas of international relations. The concept of neutrality itself is being tested in new ways. In an interconnected world of economic sanctions, cyber warfare, and global information flows, the lines of conflict are no longer as clearly drawn as they were in 1945. For countries that have traditionally held a neutral or non-aligned stance, the pressure to choose sides is immense. De Valera's balancing act between the Allies and the Axis has modern parallels in the choices nations must make between competing economic and political blocs. His experience serves as a reminder that maintaining an independent path requires constant vigilance, deft diplomacy, and a clear understanding of the potential costs. The moral dimension of his condolence call also echoes in contemporary debates. Today's leaders are frequently confronted with situations where diplomatic protocol clashes with moral outrage. How should democratic nations engage with authoritarian regimes that commit human rights abuses? Is it better to maintain dialogue and diplomatic ties, as de Valera did with Germany, in the hope of exerting influence, or is it better to isolate and condemn? The question of whether to separate the state from the regime, a distinction de Valera attempted to make, remains a central and unresolved challenge in modern diplomacy. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of de Valera's choice is its capacity to force us to ask uncomfortable questions. It reminds us that history is not a simple story of heroes and villains, but a complex tapestry woven with difficult choices made by fallible people under immense pressure. It challenges us to consider what we would do in a similar position, with the survival of our nation at stake. As we look at the conflicts shaping our world today, the ghost of Éamon de Valera and his lonely walk to the German legation stands as a powerful and cautionary figure, a symbol of the profound and often painful burdens of leadership.